jazz pianist Johnny Radu called Confessions. And the second one was Bagatelle from the Ukrainian composer Nikolai Kapustin, from a cycle of 10 bagatelles, and this one that I played was the number 8. And I'm not sure if we have time for another short one.
A short one, yes, please.
Yeah. So I think I'm gonna play another one from Johnny Raducanu called Serpentines.
Thanks a lot, Johnny. Mulțumesc mult.
Thank you.
Johnny Beaker, strong background in classical music, you heard it, but for all passionated by jazz and improvisation, you're doing a PhD, if I'm not wrong, or if you did it already. You did a PhD in music at the National University of Music in Bukarest, and you are considered as one of the most creative pianists of your generation, and you're playing on stages such as the Bukarest Jazz Festival and also George Enescu Festival. So thanks again for being here. Thanks a lot. Before I give the floor to Horatiu Decuble, who will moderate the first part of this festival, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Joachim Umlauf. I'm the director of the Goethe Institut. And though I have the pleasure to moderate tomorrow a debate, I will not hold a speech. I can say everything I want tomorrow when I will be in a debate with Jonas Lüscher. Dear public, dear writer, we wish you a very warm welcome, excellencies, and we are more than happy that His Excellency, the Ambassador of Ukraine, Igor Prokopchuk, is here amongst us, and we would like to ask you to say some words to us, to the public.
Dear Dr. Umlauf, distinguished directors of the festival, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to be able to attend the ceremony of official opening of the 9th International Literature Festival of Odesa. As we meet today, this official ceremony is just 2 days that separate us from the 24th of February, which is a 2 years mark from the day when Russian missiles started to pound Ukrainian cities and towns all across Ukraine, and the Russian forces started the invasion into the Ukrainian territory. this caused the biggest humanitarian crisis in Europe since the end of the Second World War. Millions of displaced persons, millions of refugees, tens of thousands of killed and wounded, and the war continues. As we approach this mark, let me kindly ask you to pay respect to those killed with a minute of silence. Thank you very much. I'm pleased that this festival takes place in the city of Bukarest, in the capital of Romania, the country whose leadership and the people of Romania have shown so much support and empathy to Ukraine and Ukrainians from the very first days of the war, that played an extremely important role in rendering the support and assistance and the welcome that Ukrainians experienced in this country. It was not only material assistance, but I think also the assistance and support that we were receiving in cultural terms, in terms of human-to-human context, that play a very significant role in helping Ukrainian resilience and helping Ukraine stand against the Russian aggression. I looked at the topics selected for this year's festival and see that they were very well chosen and very relevant to the current situation. This is about the future of Europe, about the power of words in fighting the barbarism, and literary relations between the countries of the Black Sea, and the worldwide reading of Ukrainian literature on the 24th of February in connection with these 2 years of Russia's war against Ukraine, which will include also the reading of works by Ukrainian artists Volodymyr Vakulenko, Victoria Amelina, and Maxim Kravchuk, who were killed in this war. Volodymyr Vakulenko was shot basically right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Victoria Amelina was killed last year in a missile attack in a town of Kramatorsk, which she was visiting together with a few Colombian journalists, as she was very keen to collect all the evidence of Russian atrocities on the Ukrainian land and to well document them also through her literary work. And the recent victim, Maxim Krivtsov, who was killed only last month at the front. It is the people of different professions who defend Ukraine, who defend democracy, and who are also victims of this war. So I'm very glad that during this festival, it is also that we will pay tribute to them and to their literary work, which is so important for us to understand the complexities of this war and also what the people need to go through. I wish you all very enjoyable and successful 3 days of the festival, interesting meetings, interesting ideas, and again, thank you so much for hosting and organizing this festival in Bucharest. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, His Excellency, for your serious and right words. Thank you very much. I will give the floor to Horatiu Decuble, professor in the Bucharest University, professor for German studies. Please, Horatiu.
Thank you. I was supposed to actually present you, but ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, Your Excellency, highly esteemed partners and highly esteemed invited authors, dear friends of literature from around the world. I am more than honored to be appointed as a moderator this evening, not because I'm a moderate person. I will try to be, not giving you a lecture as a professor and not giving you a reading as a writer, but together with my colleague and friend, Dr. Joachim Umlauf, to moderate the grand opening of the 9th International Literature Festival Odesa. Why Odesa in Bukarest? Well, this is a painful question. In fact, so painful, it could motivate some of us to shed tears, but also so painful that it should motivate all of us to raise hopes that despite war, despite tyranny and hatred, literature will still find its path to and its place in our hearts. And literature will still enjoy a broad audience. Well, before I start speculate over the reasons why Odesa elsewhere or Odesa in Bucharest, I'd like to invite here one of the very experienced cultural manager in the world, who was over the decades responsible for the internationally renowned literature festival in Leukerbad, also the director of the Literaturfest Bern, and the co-founder and co-director of the International Literature Festival Odesa, Mr. Hans Ruprecht. Please, Hans, you have the floor. He will address you in German. I'll try to translate, okay?
Okay. Ja, also ich bin aus Bern und eben das Literaturfestival in Odesa begann eigentlich 2013 in Iași an das Filin-Festival. Hat uns Andrei Kurkov angefragt, ein Festival in Odesa zu organisieren. Und ich war natürlich davon begeistert, weil ich zuvor schon in Lemberg, also Lviv, und auch in Czernowitz Veranstaltungen durchgeführt habe. Und eben Odesa ein so wundervoller Ort, so geschichtsträchtiger Ort ist, haben wir dann natürlich sofort die Initiative gegriffen und angefangen, aber da kam zuerst noch der Maidan dazu. Wir mussten es ein bisschen aufschieben und konnten dann 2015 die erste Ausgabe durchführen.
Also the idea was originates actually in Iași in Romania, 2015? 13, yeah. But then again, there were some organizational problems. Hans had to do some trips to Lviv, and that's where Odesa was the first first city to think of as a possible address. And yeah, this is the way it came to...
beginning.
Yeah, the beginnings, the very beginnings of this festival.
Gut.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Hans Ruprecht. A big applause for your initiative. And the second co-founder and co-organizer of the Odesa Literature Festival, worldwide renowned, being the manager, the director of the glamorous Literaturfestival Berlin, is Ulrich Schreiber. Please, Ulrich, you have the word.
Thank you, Horatiu. Thank you. Thank you all. I'm very glad that we can be here, that we can... Hello, Tatjana, one of my team, the former team, the Berlin Festival. I see it just now because we had, yeah, it's wonderful. You know, we had the possibility to cancel the festival 2 years ago after the war starts, and or to postpone the festival, but we thought we will do it nearby in a country in the Black Sea region. And the first festival we did 2022 in after the war starts in Batumi. It went quite well. Then we thought what we will do. First idea was Constanta, and but since the literary community, the scene in Romania, more crowd and more media are here in Bukarest, and especially the Goethe Institute and the other cultural institutes from Europe, then we thought perhaps it's better, and now I'm very sure it was better to decide this place. And also the Goethe Institute here, this venue is very good. I'm glad that the budget is a little bit smaller than in the past years, but I think we realize a quite good program. I'm glad that so many authors are also in town, not only digitally here. Some of them are live streams. With live streams will attend in the festival. Yeah. Okay, wish you very good days here and lots of inspiration, and I want only to underline the importance of Ukrainian literature. We did a lot of work. We did for the worldwide reading. We did it also September 7th in 2022, but we want to repeat it, and that's I think makes sense. We did also a film which we will present in 2 days. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Ulrich, for your welcome. So you heard it, Bucharest by the Sea. I'm now pleased and honored to invite here Mrs. Laura Napolitano, the director of the Italian Cultural Institute, and also on behalf of the EUNIC, the European Network of National Cultural Institutes, to address her greetings, please.
Thank you. So, good evening. I'm Laura Napolitano, director of the Italian Cultural Institute here in Bucharest, and I'm honored to be here on behalf of the cluster EUNIC Romania to the opening of the Odesa International Literature Festival. So as Your Excellencies, the Ambassador of Ukraine remembered, Saturday will mark the second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And we, as EUNIC cluster, wanted to deepen the acts of solidarity towards Ukraine and to promote the visibility and embeddedness of Ukrainian culture in Romania and in Europe. And that is why we embraced the proposal of the two curators of the festival, Hans Ruprecht and Ulrich Schreiber, to host the festival here in Bucharest. So in time of violence and war, what is the use of literature? In the past 2 years, I read so many articles and reportages about the war in Ukraine, and the phrase of Ukrainian philosopher and journalist Volodymyr Yermolenko struck me especially, and I quote, "Literature during the war is both a blasphemy and a duty. It's a blasphemy because the reality of the war cannot be expressed in word, but the war makes you speechless, silent, and any attempt to break this silence of mourning seems to be blasphemous. Yet literature during the war is also a duty. We have a duty to speak, to witness, to confess, to make testimonies. An evil which is buried in silence is an evil that will return." So this is especially true for Ukrainian writers directly and personally affected by this war, but these words testify to the importance of not being silent and to the special role that literature has in this regard. literature fulfills a very human need to make sense of the senseless and tell stories. So what can a literature festival outside Ukraine do then? We can testify our support. We can also raise awareness, foster understanding, and connect people across boundaries of geography, language, and ideology. And the words of all the writers gathered here in Bucharest and the freedom to use them are our act of revolt against violence. So the Odesa International Literature Festival continues, temporary outside Ukraine, to prove that literature and literary figures can help building bridges between geographical and cultural rifts, encouraging dialogue and protecting free speech in times of turmoil and brutality. So before leaving the floor to our guest and to literature, I would like to thank the institution that made this festival possible, the European Cultural Foundation via the Culture of Solidarity Funds, the Jan Michalski Foundation, Pro Helvetia, EUNIC Romania, of course, and of course the Goethe Institute in Bucharest and its director Joachim Umlauf for hosting us. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Napolitano, for these warm words. I know Joachim was so nice to introduce me, but as a moderator, I'd like some reciprocity. He told me he wouldn't have a speech this night, but imagine Joachim. Joachim is one of the most active directors of cultural institutes I ever know. I mean, I first met him in Paris 2.5 decades ago. And back then he was the director of the Maison Heine for now 5 years or so. He runs the Goethe Institute in Bukarest, and I must say his energy is indefatigable, and his advocacy for the cause of arts in general and for the cause of literature in particular never slows down. Also, thank you. Dankeschön, Joachim. So I think we reached the highlight of this first slot of the grand opening. I am very pleased and proud to introduce one of my colleagues, Romanian colleagues, one of the most promising younger talents. You're not so young anymore, Radu. Younger talents of Romanian letters, writer and professor Radu Vancu. He will give us a lecture about a very interesting topic addressing maybe the most fascinating characteristic of Europe, that is the energy and the power which resides in each one of us to constantly reshape Europe and its future generation for generation. Radu, you have the word.
Thank you, Horatiu. When Uli wrote me about a month ago to prepare an opening speech about the future of Europe, there came into my mind some words George Steiner wrote in his autobiography. Steiner says there that the invention of future tense was the most, in language, in grammar, I mean, was the most effective concrete tool our species had in building a concrete future. And I think this is what we do at literary festivals like this. We try to use our words in order to project a future for Ukraine, for Europe, for our species as such. And as long as we lend our words the property of projecting a future, our species will have a future. So I'll read It's not a long text, the title is A Humanity Whose Words Do Not Fail the Human. History has become horror again, as it has always been, except for these 8 decades of peace, relative peace, in the European Union after World War II. And even this peace was relative, as one should not forget the atrocity of the war in Yugoslavia, or the war in Transnistria, or some local wars in this area which made this peace relative. Whenever we tend to have a too high opinion on our human species, we should moderate it with the thought that this is the longest period of relative peace we have ever been able to build in our entire history, 8 decades. While the oldest rock art depicting a war is dated about 10,000 years BCE. 12,000 years of war, 80 years of peace. For every year of peace, 150 years of war. This simple arithmetic should have sufficed in making us believe unconditionally in Judith Shklar's liberalism of fear, which tried to educate us to be afraid of the collapse of liberal institutions and their replacement with institutions of horror. Shklar was right. We should have been more afraid of our destructive nature. Sloterdijk was also right to notice in Rage and Time that, unlike the usual contemporary perception, war has been our natural state as a species, while peace was the exception. As Amos Oz bitterly noticed in December 2016, we have ceased to be terrified by the legacy of Hitler and Stalin. Thence the impulse to retest again their totalitarian anti-democratic ideologies. The barbaric war launched by Russia in Ukraine is exactly this, an attempt to deny everything liberal democracies have managed to build after World War II, and to revert to the anti-democratic order where states are run not by civilians we elect to protect us from war, but by militarists destroying any institution and any human being opposing their ideology of war. In Freudian terms, Russia's barbaric war is a return of our repressed militaristic anti-democratic ego, the ego responsible for our 12,000 years of uninterrupted war. While Vladimir Putin is the perfect image of this militaristic ego, as Hitler and Stalin have also been in their time, Ukraine stands as a metonymy for our other ego who has managed to build, using the fragile institutions of liberal democracy, the most solid and continuous period of peace and prosperity known in our human history. In barbaric times, perhaps the only advantage we have is that narratives simplify. We know exactly where barbarity stands, just as we know exactly where humanity stands. In the latest version of this narrative, to side with Russia means to be on the side of our barbaric militaristic ego, which represents indeed the dominant political past of our species. To be with Ukraine is to hope that our pacifistic, pro-democratic and pro-human ego still represents the future of our species. To stand with Ukraine is literally to believe our human species has a future, not only as a species, but as a humane one. The horror, the horror. Joseph Conrad's words from Heart of Darkness come into my mind every time I read the news, therefore daily. And in those days when I first read about the horrors of Bucha, the shattering story of Miklos Radnoti came into my mind. As he was of Jewish descent, the great Hungarian poet was murdered in November 1944 and thrown into a common grave. In June 1946, his wife, Fanny Gyarmati, found him there, exhumed him, and found in his pocket a notebook with poems. Half of them love letters for her, the other half poems describing everyday life in that inferno. Fanny's love has made literature return from the grave. It has made literature literally stronger than death. Radnoti's literature was proof that barbarity will never have the final word. Given enough love, our words will always return from the grave in order to stand witness that our pro-human ego is stronger than the anti-human one, and thus to give meaning to all art's attempts to stand witness that this luminous ego exists, that we are not only the species which creates common graves, but also the species which creates beauty and kindness. Radnoti's story also came into my mind when I found out about the assassination of the Ukrainian writers Volodymyr Vakulenko, by the Russian troops sometime between March and May 2022 in a village near Izium. Vakulenko told his father he was keeping a diary of those infernal times, which he will bury in the garden if he feels his life is in danger. After Vakulenko was murdered and the village was recaptured by the Ukrainian forces, Vakulenko's father and the writer Victoria Amelina, a recipient of the Joseph Conrad Literary Award and finalist of the European Prize for Literature, dug the garden, found the diary, and published it. It is exactly the same story: literature returning from the grave and not allowing barbarity to have the final word. Beauty standing witness that, given enough love, our species still has a chance. 1 year afterwards, in July 2023, Victoria Amelina was killed by a Russian bomb while she was in a pizza house in Kramatorsk with fellow writers and journalists. She was 37 years old. Her extraordinary work is again proof that barbarity will never have the final word. In January 2024, the Ukrainian poet Maxim Krivtsov was killed 2 days after he posted on Facebook his last poem, in which he presciently wrote about his own death. He was 34. His extraordinary poems are again the proof that our humanity has a future. In the early months of 1940, less than half a year after the beginning of World War II, when another fundamental narrative of humanity versus barbarity was taking place, Walter Benjamin wrote, "There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism." For me, one of the fundamental consequences of Benjamin's dictum regards our functions as artists. It is maybe our fundamental task to not allow the documents of barbarism to define us and to turn them into documents of civilization, to stand witness for our humanity, to show that we and our fellow humans can even be killed, but our humanity cannot be destroyed. It's a difficult task and a risky one for too many reasons. But there are some luminous examples in how it can be achieved. I think, for example, of Benjamin Britten using 8 of Wilfred Owen's extraordinary poems about war in his no less extraordinary War Requiem, 1962. Owen was killed in action at the end of World War I, exactly 1 week before the armistice. He was 25, and according to Harold Bloom, one of the greatest poets of English language in the 20th century. Almost half a century afterwards, Benjamin Britten used Owen's art in order to sustain his own, while composing the War Requiem for the victims of the 2 world wars. Owen's death, as well as the deaths of other tens of millions, were documents of barbarism. Owen's poems, as well as Britten's music, are documents of civilization, proving that barbarity will never have the final word. That it is Owen and Britten and not Hitler or Stalin or Putin that define our humanity. Even though the latter can create wars and mass murder, which kills tens of millions of human beings, they cannot destroy humanity as we know it can and must be. Our art is our proof that the victims are the definition of humanity and not their suppressors. Another luminous example is that of Paul Celan. This great poet, whose existence intersects Ukraine, Romania, France, and Germany, used his words in order to transform a document of barbarism, namely the assassination of his parents in the Holocaust, into one of civilization. As he wrote in a letter from November 1947 to the Swiss critic Max Rüchner, he chose to write in German after having written about 18 poems in Romanian because, while being the language of his mother's assassins, it was also the language he spoke with his mother. He used his words in order to recreate a verbal space where his communion with his mother was still possible. It was, in the most literal meaning, poetry written against death, and as witness for those killed by the Nazi ideology of extermination. In his Bremen Prize acceptance speech, Celan explicitly wrote that after passing through, these are Celan's words, passing through the 1,000 darknesses of the murderous speeches, language survived when human beings were murdered, and it was enriched, angereichert, he says in German, by their humanity. Poetry is the witness of these assassinated human beings, Celan says. It is the proof that they were killed, but they can never be destroyed. One critic once noticed that all Celan's poems are an immediate intertext with the Holocaust. I agree with the coda that, as such, they refuse to give the Holocaust the final word. His poems are what the victims declare after the 1,000 darknesses of the murderous speeches have long ended their effects. I can also mention here Caroline Forché's extraordinary anthology from 1993, Against Forgetting. Forché has gathered here, with the wonderful insight and exigence of the great poet she herself is, about 150 poets from the 20th century writing in times of war, genocide, totalitarianism, extermination camps, etc. Some of them have survived, some others not. Their poems are always documents for the survival of humanity, even in the most inhuman conditions. This is the world we have to build with our words, a world in which they are used not to design ideologies of extermination, a world in which, quite on the contrary, words are witness against barbarity, witness that people can be murdered but not destroyed. We have to build a world where words do not fail the human, not again. Or else, everything literature ever stood for, everything arts ever stood for, was simply a lie. The only humanity which is not a dead civilization is this one, a humanity whose words do not fail the human. In the same essay on history, written less than a half year after the beginning of World War II, Walter Benjamin notices that the amazement that barbarity is still possible in the 20th century works in favor of fascism. What must be attained, Benjamin writes, is the notion that barbarity is always possible. And therefore we have, and Benjamin writes this with italics, to bring about a real state of emergency. We should always act as if humanity is in a real state of emergency, always. Benjamin's plea for this perpetual state of emergency in favor of the human came into my mind when I read Amos Oz's plea for the order of the teaspoon, which says something like that. Amos Oz's words. I believe that if one person is watching a huge calamity, let's say a conflagration, a fire, there are always three principal options. 1, run away as far away and fast as you can, and let those who cannot run burn. 2, write an angry letter, a very angry letter, to the editor of your paper, demanding that the responsible people be removed from office with disgrace, or, for that matter, launch a demonstration. 3, bring a bucket of water and throw it on the fire. And if you don't have a bucket, bring a glass. And if you don't have a glass, use a teaspoon. Everyone has a teaspoon. And yes, I know a teaspoon is little and the fire is huge, but there are millions of us and each one of us has a teaspoon. Now, I would like to establish the order of the teaspoon. People who share my attitude, not the runaway attitude or the letter attitude, but the teaspoon attitude, I would like them to walk around wearing a little teaspoon on the lapel of their jackets, so that we know that we are in the same movement, in the same brotherhood, in the same order, the order of the teaspoon. And this is where Amos Oz's words end. I have met people wearing that small teaspoons at their lapels, showing thus that they belong to a human community which no historic catastrophe could shatter. There is a continuity and therefore a truth of human values which no barbarism could destroy. And there is no barbaric fire which our tiny humanistic teaspoons cannot extinguish. Art is a good collection of such used teaspoons. They are already old, but they have served their duty well and will continue to serve it. Before ending this manifesto for a humanity whose words do not fail the human, let me say a few words about the contemporary rage against Russian culture, which resembled the rage against German culture after World War II. The file Russian culture versus Russian barbarism reproduces the file German culture versus German barbarism, which dominated in the 1950s European discussions about the function of art. Then and now, the question is the same. Since culture does not prevent barbarism, what good is culture? Since German music and German philosophy and the German literature, all superlative, could not make the German people humane enough not to produce Nazism, what good is each of them? What good is a culture which does not make us more human? The revolt contained in this question is what made Adorno bitterly conclude in 1951 that writing poetry after Auschwitz was barbaric. And it is the same revolt that made George Steiner claim in an article published as late as 1960 that, George Steiner's words, German language was not innocent of the horrors of Nazism, and Hitler found in it the latent hysteria he needed in order to craft his ideology of extermination. There is a similar contemporary rage against Russian culture. Just as Adorno denied the moral right of poetry after Auschwitz, for any Ukrainian, the moral right of Russian literature ceases after Bucha and Mariupol. Just as for Steiner, German language was Hitler's accomplice, Russian literature is, in the eyes of any Ukrainian, Putin's accomplice. And what one can indeed easily detect diachronically across the entire history of Russian literature, a strong pan-Russian, anti-European, anti-democratic vein. Coming from Dostoevsky, passing through innumerable writers of all sizes, and reaching contemporaries like Zahar Prilepin, this anti-European and anti-democratic vein can justifiably be seen due to its continuity, persistence, massiveness, and intensity as the very backbone of all Russian literature. It makes immediately understandable the visceral rejection of Russian literature by Ukrainians, just as, in its time, it was immediately understandable the rejection in corpore of German culture after Nazism. As both Adorno and Steiner were influential and authoritative, their opinion quickly became the general opinion. Those who were hurt by it and felt it was unfair were, not surprisingly, poets themselves. Paul Celan felt hurt. He had already written an impressive body of his Holocaust poems in 1951 when Adorno had issued his statement. Todesfuge was written in 1945. As we have seen before, his poetry written in German created a verbal community with his mother. And now he felt that Adorno's moral interdiction on poetry was depriving him of the last possibility to reconnect with the dear persons Nazism has brutally taken from him. Czesław Miłosz was also hurt. He had written some extraordinary poems about the Polish Holocaust, such as Campo dei Fiori, written in the Easter days of 1943. It took almost 2 decades for Adorno to admit he was not entirely right. In his last book, Negative Dialectics, he acknowledges that after reading Celan, he understood, and these are his words, poetry is our inalienable right to scream under torture. Therefore, to write poetry witnessing in favor of the victim in the language of assassins is to defeat assassins. It would be an injustice not to see that Russian literature also displays a pro-European humanist tradition. Thinner, much thinner than the anti-democratic one, it is in no way negligible, as it spans 2 centuries and some major authors, starting with Chekhov and Turgenev, continuing with Akhmatova and Mandelstam, and Pasternak and Tsvetaeva, and reaching today to Ludmila Ulitskaya and Mikhail Shishkin. They all explicitly felt part of the European culture. Some of them even identified more as European than as Russians. Turgenev, for example, in his final quarrel with Dostoevsky, when the author of The Possessed accused him of betraying Russia with his philo-Europeanism, replied bluntly, "But I am not a Russian, I am German." The scene is reproduced at length in Orlando Figes' The Europeans. Chekhov is one of the major humanist artists worldwide. Mandelstam and Akhmatova are among the most freedom-loving poets of the entire 20th century. They were mercilessly crushed by the communist regime exactly because of that. This is a humanist vein which Europe will also want to recover 2 decades from now. It took Adorno almost 20 years to say that he had to tone down his harsh statements. There is an art which serves and justifies the barbarity of the tyrants, and there is another art which gives the victims their voice, the voice necessary to scream under torture, the voice necessary to bear witness. It is only this last voice which is indeed the voice of art, and it is precisely this voice which stands proof that no barbarism can definitely destroy the human. If Germany re-became one of the major European hearts, this was possible because it admitted his tragic barbaric error and had the political and social will to develop a guilty conscience. It was, and still is, an educational program of unprecedented amplitude. After 1945, Germany had a future because of this moral admission of its guilty past. If Russia wants to have a future after losing the war with Ukraine, it will have to undergo a similar moral process of admitting and repenting its tragic barbaric error. Unfortunately for Russia, I do not see any political and social will on its side to develop this moral reaction. Bluntly said, because of its importance to deal with its guilty past, Russia will have no future. As for Ukraine, we all see and admire its extraordinary spirit born from a moral reaction in front of barbarism. President Zelensky's extraordinary words, "I need ammunition, not a ride," uttered in front of highly probable death, were the beginning of this massive moral reaction which catalyzed the formidable Ukrainian present and future. Which means that Russian barbarism has not managed to destroy Ukraine. Russian barbarism has destroyed Russia more than anything else. As for Ukrainian writers, they have done exactly what real artists do when history becomes horror. They have given voice to those who needed it in order to scream against barbarism. They have used their words as witness against atrocity. They have not allowed barbarity to have the final word. So that Vakulenko and Amelina and Krivtsov will define us as human species and not Putin and his barbaric acolytes. If we want a future for our art and for our humanity, we should take their example and write from this perpetual state of emergency for the human, and serve literature as members of the Order of the Teaspoon, and build a humanity whose words will not fail the human anymore. If we do so, literature will reach us, even if it has to pass through common graves, that it has already done. But hopefully, it will never have to do it again. It all depends on us and on our teaspoons. Thank you.
Well, a big applause indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Radu Vancu, for these inspiring words, for this enriching material, not only in its ideas, but also emotionally. Thus, ladies and gentlemen, the first slot in the grand opening of the 9th International Literature Festival at Odesa comes to its end. I thank you all for having attended, and please enjoy the pause, the short pause.